And we're having a transition to go from what we were talking about, living donation, particularly in the Sunni context, where we're talking about living donation in general, then living donation in the Sunni context, in the legal context, to now a break. We're going to talk a little bit about lived experiences. And we're also going to go to different places. So you're going to hear a little bit about a Shi'i context in Iran. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Ilham Mireshghi, who is here from the University of, well, she is here at the University of Chicago, but she's an anthropologist of medicine and public policy. She's presently a lecturer here at the University of Chicago Divinity School. She's done extensive work, and probably the most extensive work, on the context and the ways in which individuals, both from the perspective of recipients and donors, engage with the questions and the moral dimensions about organ donation. She's also done deep sort of legal, or let's say the context of legal decision-making within the Iranian context. She's done research on that as well. So that's why in the morning I deferred a little bit to the Shia notion, so you can speak to her about that a bit as well. So inshallah, with that, I will leave the floor and give the microphone to Ilham.
So I'm a medical anthropologist, and so the perspective that you're going to be hearing today is going to be from the anthropological perspective. It's going to be based on ethnographic research, which means that it's based on the qualitative data that I gathered during my fieldwork in Iran that I did for my PhD dissertation. That was on the Iranian model for paid living unrelated kidney donation, which some have called kidney sales, right? I'm going to give you a brief overview of what kidney transplantation looks like in Iran, and then I'm going to kind of delve a little bit more deeply into paid kidney donation itself. And what I want to do is get you all to think a little bit differently about what it means to give and receive money when it comes to the donation of organs. I know that there's a lot of sensitivity on this topic, definitely from the Sunni perspective, but not just the Sunni perspective, within the Jewish perspective, within various schools of thought in Christianity, and also from a very secular perspective, there's a lot of sensitivity to the idea of commodifying the body. And that's something that I want to slightly challenge today, get us to think about the transaction of money in a different way. And I hope we're going to have questions, time for you to ask questions for me about this as well. So, okay. So the overview is that the majority of kidneys that are transplanted in Iran come from people who are paid. So they come from strangers who are paid. And the statistic is that it's approximately 65 to 70% of kidney transplants are from living strangers. That's a number that's actually declining. And brain death donation is about 20 to 30%, which is a number that is increasing. And altruistic living-related donation, people donating to their family members, takes up about 5% of the donations. So something that's interesting about the Iranian case is that even though paid donation constitutes the majority of transplants, the number is declining, meaning that at an institutional level, everybody is interested in and determined to increase cases of brain death and to gradually, completely replace paid living unrelated donation. So even though it might be something that is defended, it is something that is seen as a pragmatic, temporary solution, and brain death donation is considered to be kind of the morally superior form of transplantation. So both brain death and paid LURD are sanctioned by Shia jurists. In the past, I have presented extensively on how it is that Shia jurists came to the conclusion. The majority of Shia jurists came to the conclusion that paid donation or straight-out sales is permissible. I'm going to very briefly touch on that today, but the focus is going to be kind of paid donation from an ethnographic perspective. So to give you a little bit of background about kind of the infrastructure of medicine in Iran, which affects the attitudes of both the patients, doctors, and as well as the jurists towards transplantation, is that Iran has a welfare medical kind of system. So you do have privatized healthcare options but the majority of health facilities are public, and treatment is state subsidized. You have various chronic conditions like end-stage renal disease are heavily subsidized by the state, meaning dialysis is free. The transplantation itself is for free if it is carried out in a public hospital, and these public hospitals are oftentimes very advanced high-tech institutions. What this means is that healthcare is quite high-level, high-quality healthcare is very accessible to a large swath of the population. So even in rural areas, people have access, have knowledge of, and of advanced kind of medical interventions, and they see themselves as qualified recipients of that kind of care. And so what this does is that it creates a sort of trust in medicine that is somewhat unique in the region. So if you do a comparison between the attitudes of not only patients in the general public, but also jurists in, say, Iran compared to Egypt, there seems to be a lot less sensitivity to some of the very controversial biomedical topics because, on the one hand, there is much less inequality in terms of who can gain access to advanced healthcare, who can become a recipient, say, of a kidney transplant. And also, another crucial element is the effect of the Islamic Revolution and this kind of promise, this revolutionary promise of building an exemplary, modern, technologically advanced nation, and the creation of a sort of a nativist biomedical infrastructure that would be an example to the Muslim world and would be authentically Islamic and Iranian. And so the idea that biomedicine can be something that is homegrown and emanates from within and is not necessarily something that is an intrusion from the secular Western world has played a huge role in attitudes of regular people as well as our jurists in embracing and becoming receptive to various biotechnological interventions. So let me briefly talk about brain death kidney donation, and then I'm going to jump into paid donation. So in a study of 706 adults in Tehran conducted by Bruman, 84.6% were willing to donate. And out of these people, 64.3% of them who believed, often incorrectly, that their marja, or Islamic jurist, was against organ donation, stated that they were still willing to donate. And what this means is that regardless of whether they thought that this was Islamically permissible or not, the vast majority, 80% of people were willing to become organ donors after death. And this has to do with the widespread campaign that Iran has been conducting for at least a decade now, since 2002, but most aggressively in the past 10 to 15 years, trying to promote brain death organ donation through soap operas, films, infomercials, just the whole gamut. And so it's not uncommon to find Iranians from various socioeconomic classes holding one of these donation cards in their wallet. And many times in Iran, when somebody would hear that I was working on organ donation, the first thing they would do is they would open up their wallet and say, hey, I have one of these cards too. Or maybe a house cleaner would come up to me and say, hey, where do I go? Where do I go to sign up for this? So there's kind of a unique openness to the idea of brain death organ donation in Iran as a result of the campaign and the extensive kind of public media outreach that has been invested in changing people's attitudes towards brain death donation. So the vast majority of cases are still paid kidney donation, right? Iran's program for unrelated kidney donation has been called the Iranian model. Some people think of this as something to be a program to be emulated, and some have been very critical of this. The way that it works is that there is a nonprofit NGO by the name of the Iran Kidney Foundation that administers donor and recipient waiting lists. It's actually an organization that started in 1980. They were a group of people who themselves were recipients of transplants. They were patients who were on dialysis, so they were people who were very close to the challenges and the challenges that kidney patients face, and they decided to create a support group for patients. And that support group gradually turned into this larger organization that would provide all kinds of services and lobby the government for all kinds of services to chronic kidney disease patients. And so now, after almost 40 years, one of their main tasks is the administration of the matching of donors and recipients, living donors and recipients. They do not work with the brain death waiting list. But what they do is they have created a set of protocols. And basically, when you talk about the Iranian model for paid kidney donation, this is generally what the protocols or what the program looks like. So the donor and the recipient must share a nationality. So if you're an Afghan refugee or a Pakistani refugee in Iran, you can't give or receive a kidney from an Iranian. If you are a British citizen, and you want to travel to Iran, or you're a Yemeni citizen and you want to travel to Iran to receive a kidney, that is also not permissible unless you bring your own donor that shares the same nationality as you. So it is perfectly fine, and it happens for people from Gulf countries, from people from Turkey and elsewhere to travel to Iran to make use of the facilities and the expertise, but they have to bring in their own donors. They have to share the same nationality on their passport. That used to not be the case, but it's something that has been very strictly enforced in recent, I would say, at least in the past decade or so. The donor can be male or female, and they must be between 20 to 40 years old. Parental or spousal consent is needed, so if you're married, then regardless of whether you're the wife or the husband, you would have to have the consent of your spouse. And if not, or if you're, I think the only people who don't need anybody's consent are divorced donors. Otherwise, divorced donors you might still need parental consent. If you're female, you might still need your father's consent. But if you're married, then you only need your spouse's consent. The donor must not have a family member with ESRD. So if you have a father or a sibling or a child that has end-stage renal disease, you're not allowed to become a paid donor. The expectation is that you would save that kidney to donate potentially to your own family member. So the donor receives what is oftentimes called a reward from the state and a larger compensation from the recipient. The amount of that reward has not changed in the past 20 or so years, but the amount of the larger compensation from the recipient has been raising with inflation. It started from something around 1 million tamans, which would have been closer to like $1,000, to I think the most recent amount is 15 million tamans, which used to be equivalent to about $5,000 to $6,000. Now with the value of the taman dropping, it's closer to, again, about $1,000. So the transplant surgeries are performed in advanced public university hospitals. Expenses to the recipient are minimal. So in this situation, it's both the recipient that doesn't have to incur much cost for this procedure, as well as the donor that will actually have to pay for their own checkups and for their own lab fees before they're actually put on a waiting list. So though payment is regulated and standardized, donor and recipient often independently agree to different amounts. So even though it's formally announced each year what the amount, the regulated amount for compensation is, it's very difficult for the organization to control any other sort of exchange between the donor and recipient before or after the operation. So it's very common that they will agree to an amount that is different, oftentimes slightly or sometimes a little bit more significantly larger than the amount that is formally announced. But what is interesting in the Iranian case is that the donor and recipient are often from similar socioeconomic classes. So the way that we often think about cases of organ trafficking or kidney sales is that the poor become repositories of organs for the rich. It's the rich people who can afford to buy the kidneys. In the Iranian context, there's been a lot of kind of emphasis put on making transplantation accessible to those who are most affected by it, which happen to be people from underprivileged classes of society. And so the amount that they would have to pay to compensate the donor is affordable for most people. And there are also various philanthropic organizations that contribute to those funds to try to help people to make those payments. So all the rules that are put into place, for the most part, are there to protect the kidney patients, to prevent, say, organ trafficking, or to prevent from there being kind of an auctioning of organs that would make it very difficult for the poor to afford obtaining a transplant. So patients who are eligible for transplant enter recipient list. And the people who are eligible donors, meaning that they are between the ages of 18 and 40, or in some places 20 and 40 years old, who have already passed all of the tests, will be put on the waiting list. And if they at any point get cold feet and pull out, they are no longer allowed to enter the waiting list. So the idea, again, here is to protect the recipients. They don't want someone who is kind of indecisive to get back on the list and maybe jeopardize another person's opportunity to receive a kidney. So the moral economy of paid LURD. What you guys see here is handwritten advertisements on the wall surrounding the Kidney Patient Foundation. So if you go to any transplant center, any dialysis center, wherever you have like a critical mass of kidney patients, you're going to see these handwritten advertisements even on trees. You'll see them on posters. You'll see them written all over the walls. And this is kind of the face of what is often called the black market for kidneys in Iran. You'll see all kinds of alarmist newspaper reports about how people are auctioning, people are selling their body parts as a sign of kind of moral depravity or as a sign of suffering in Iranian society. I did a lot of ethnographic research within these spaces. I did a lot of fieldwork sitting in the Kidney Patient Foundation, inside the social worker's office, where people came to talk to the social worker about why it is that they wanted to become a donor or to inquire about becoming explicitly a kidney seller, right? And I also observed people over the years in these kinds of spaces where these advertisements were, the way they engaged with the advertisements, even writing the advertisements, making phone calls and talking to people who either wanted to receive or donate a kidney, and then talking to people who actually had gone through the process, people who had been paid, and people who had made payments. And the question that came up for me is that, is this really a case of body parts being sold? And the reason that I asked this question is that all the people that I talked to were very clear about the fact that selling would be absolutely wrong. And I'll share a little anecdote that is actually an opening to one of my chapters. There was a man who walked into the social worker's office who explained that he had a problem, he had a very dire problem, and for that he needed $20 million to month. Say that's around $5,000, $6,000. That he needed $20 million to month for that. And the intern that was working there at the social worker's office said that, well, I'm sorry, but the payment is only $6 million. And he was really flustered and said, what do you mean? My problem can only be solved with 20. And they said, well, sorry, it's a set amount. Everybody receives $6 million to month. And I remember this man, must have been in his 30s, he was so aggravated and upset by the fact that they were putting a price tag, a uniform price tag for his body part. And he said, what is this? Is this chicken meat? You're treating me like chicken meat and saying all of our bodies have the same price? And so it was it's from there that I tried to kind of squeeze out what is actually happening. How is it that money is being exchanged, money is being transferred, and yet there is kind of a moralizing of this transaction that is in opposition to the idea of commodification. So people don't think of themselves as selling their body parts. Recipients don't think of themselves as buying body parts. And instead they think that what they're doing is something different, which is what I call exchanging problem solutions. When we think about awards, gift, compensation, these are terms that are oftentimes used in the case of paid donation in Iran. Well, awards are payments that you make in honor of an altruistic act. The idea is that you were motivated to save somebody's life, and in response, somebody gives you an award for it. The incentive should not have been making money, receiving money. That's not representative of what happens in Iran. People actually come in need of a financial payment. Gift exchange. Some say, well, you know, the donor is giving a gift, a kidney, and then the recipient gives them a gift in response. Well, we know that in gift exchange, there are different protocols at play. You're not supposed to expect the gift immediately. And also, you don't necessarily go in doing the act of giving, wanting an immediate set amount reciprocated, right? And when it comes to sale, monetary payment is the price of the thing that you sell, right? So if we're familiar with Karl Marx at all, we know that the financial compensation, the money that is paid for something, renders that thing commensurable with other things that are of equivalent value, right? So this microphone, say, is worth $30. The moment I can put a price tag on this and compare it to, I don't know, a $30 book, I say that these two things are made commensurable with one another. People are very clear about, both donors and recipients and people who are involved in the process, are very clear about the fact that this is not a compensation. This is not the price. This is not the value of the thing that is being exchanged. But instead, what is being exchanged is the solution of problems. So the idea is that the exchange of money is to facilitate the resolution of mutual problems. So what does that mean? So say I want to pay for my mother's heart surgery. I can't afford that heart surgery. I need a certain amount of money. I need $10,000, 10,000 tomans, or 10 million tomans, say. And there's another person who needs an organ, and that person does have 10 million tomans. Then I would receive only enough money to pay for the payment of that surgery. So really, the way that this is moralized, the way that it is understood by these people is that I did not put a price tag. This is not a price tag on my body because there is no price tag you could possibly put on a body part that belongs to God. People were very clear that this is something that belongs to God. I only have, I have amanat over it, right? But God has given me the jurisdiction. God has allowed me to use this to save somebody else's life. And God has allowed that person to save my life, to save my mother's life, by giving me the money so that I can compensate, say, that surgery. Or someone would say that you want to pay for a son's wedding, or a person without the means to work would buy a small shop. And these are all real stories. So I would talk to people who would comment on kind of the ethics of organ selling. They would say, no, organ selling is terrible. It's repugnant. It is something that should never happen. And yet I would say that's exactly what is happening everywhere. People are receiving money for this. And they'd say, but it's not selling if you're not profiting from this. And if what you're doing, if you're only receiving enough to solve a problem, a very clear problem. So for the patients, the problem is disease, inability to work, enjoy life as normal. The solution is a healthy kidney. For the donor, it could be the inability to finance a surgery, a car, home, small business, a wedding, and the solution is money. And so what I gathered from kind of this research and their conversations and the way that they actually practice the exchange was that what is being exchanged here is the solution to our problems. And so when we think about, is this exchange an equitable exchange? Not every instance of paid kidney donation was considered to be equitable. There were many people who were very resentful of what they had done. They were very resentful of the people who had paid them. But the issue was not necessarily that my body was commodified, though that could be the case. Many would experience that their bodies were treated like products. But that was not seen as something that was inevitable. And it depended on all kinds of factors that were not strictly related to the exchange of money. And some of those factors that I'm going to very, very briefly talk about were the problems that the two sides had commensurable problems? Were the sacrifices that both parties made commensurable with one another? So if somebody, for example, received enough money only to buy a motorbike that wasn't much of a financial resource for them, that broke down right away, there would be more of a sense of loss and resentment. That this person gained life and is living a healthy life, but I gained really nothing, just this product that failed me after a year or two. But if this sacrifice was made to pay for a surgery or to pay for a child's wedding, the value of that was comparable to saving somebody's life. And so that would be experienced as much more of an equitable exchange. Or if someone who had to sell their house or the rugs in their home in order to pay the donor, if that is the kind of sacrifice that they had to make, then that would be taken into consideration in the kind of sacrifice that the recipient or the donor had to make in giving up that kidney. So the fact that in the Iranian case, the vast majority of people who both receive and donate come from the same socioeconomic backgrounds played a huge role in them experiencing this transaction, even when substantial amount of money was being transacted, to not in any way experience this as a commodified relationship. There are instances where there's been payment and then there's been marriage between donor and recipient. There have been people who say, how else would you do something like this? How else would I give to this person who needed a kidney? Or how else would I receive a kidney from this person and never compensate them? And I remember telling one person who had received a kidney, asking her, telling her about how it's criminalized in the United States, and she said, oh, well, it must not be legal there because there's no poor people there. In America, nobody actually needs to sell their kidney. And I said, no, there's no shortage of people who would be willing to give their kidney up for money. And she said, and then she laughed and she said, well, then why do they stop them, right? So I don't have much more time to get into any of this, but I'm not trying here to necessarily advocate for developing programs for paid kidney donation in the United States or anywhere else in the world, but I also think it's definitely a conversation worth having. Oftentimes we have this kind of ideological sensitivity even in secular settings, right? Not just from like a religious perspective, that any instance of transacting money in exchange for something that should be absolutely an altruistic event as something that is defiling, as something that tarnishes, that takes away from the exchange. And I just hope that this very brief presentation gets us to think about how that might not always be the case, and are there ways for us to kind of accommodate the need, the need that many donors have to solve their own problems, and at the same time manage an equitable and culturally and religiously appropriate way of doing that. Thank you. I'm so sorry, I went way over.
I don't know if yeah, thank you a lot. I want to, since this is such a controversial topic, I want to allow for 2 questions, but then we really have to move on. So I saw 2 hands here. I think that's what I'm going to stick with.
How, as far as you could tell, did this framing of the problem that you're describing seem to emerge from people's understanding of Islam and religious teaching and perspectives?
So something that was really surprising to me was that there were a lot of people in Iran who had no idea that there were permissive fatwas permitting not just transplantation, but actually allowing the exchange of money. And in these fatwa books, they use the terminology sales. So they don't even try to make it about exchanging problem solutions or anything like that. It's just sales are permitted. People weren't necessarily aware of that. What they assumed was that if this was something that was permissible in the Islamic Republic of Iran, it could not be against Islamic law. So that's something that the people who are actually engaged in it, who had to go through a government organization, admitted that they assumed that it wasn't impermissible. But if you talk to the general public, the vast majority think that this is just something that happens, that it's not really regulated, and it must not be allowed in Islam. I even talked to seminary students in Iran who had not worked on this topic before, and when I would mention the fact that there's fatwas on the topic, they would say that, oh, and they prohibit them, right? I said, no, they actually permit them, and that would be shock, right? Really? So I think that people are more inclined to think that this is something that isn't permissible than to think that it is.
You mentioned the example of somebody who needs to pay for their mother open heart surgery, which would be more than $1,000 probably. Is there a negotiation involved? Is it a lump sum? Can people pay on a monthly basis? Is there a set price?
So what the Kidney Patient Foundation does is that it tries to regulate it such that there is a set amount that is paid right after the surgery. So there's a contract between the two parties. And say it's the 15 million to months, and they would receive it at some point after the surgery. They would go to a center and collect that money. So the donor, the recipient, would transfer that amount into a bank account, and then that money would be transferred to them. But they can't really stand in the way of people negotiating more than that and having agreements of receiving something before the surgery, or a lot of times it's not even based on a contract. I mean, a lot of times it is, but sometimes there is such a close bond created between the recipient and the donor that it might be a lifetime relationship. I've heard of cases where people are like, I've known this family for 10 years, I visit them during Eid, I make, financial contributions for their child's wedding or, school expenses. And so that's the sort of thing that they have not, that they're not actually interested in regulating. So I would say in a lot of the bioethics literature that emerges from Iran, I would say from many medical doctors who are actually very distant from what happens on the ground, they will oftentimes say that the Iranian system is defensible. In fact, the article that I have included in your booklets by Alireza Bagheri makes that claim. It's in defense of compensation, but he sees it as compensation for time lost or for the effort that is made or for the labor, right? But he doesn't want there to be a relationship between donor and recipient so that there can be a demand put on the recipient to make more payments. And that's something that is very common in generally the bioethical kind of discourse. But from what I saw on the ground, if there is any humanity in this sort of a transaction when money is involved, even when money isn't involved, it's when people are able to create human relationships and they're able to kind of solve each other's problems. And those advertisements that you see on the wall, though they might seem like the face of the black market, those are actually people's attempt to circumvent what they see as the standardization of the value of their body. They try to circumvent the kind of uniformity that is imposed, which to them feels more like commodifying their bodies, because they would say, my problem is unique. I'm not seeking to profit from this. My problem is unique. It will be different from the person standing next to me. And so I will try to find my own recipient so that I can tell them what I need this for. And if that person can afford it, then we can get into a human relationship where we try to solve each other's problems. But of course, pragmatically, when you try to institute that at a national level, it becomes very difficult.
I mean, thanking Tam for an amazing presentation. Every time I do you, I learn something new. So I think we have to continue to do this, huh? It's like 2-3 years.